Mission Impossible 3 is the third installment in the Mission Impossible franchise, and it was directed by J.J Abrams, it stars Tom Cruise, and was released in 2006. This movie takes place about 6 years or so after the second film ended, so it's been quite a long time. And Ethan Hunt has now found good things about life outside of IMF. He's found a really nice woman, this woman really cares for her, and he really finds this great relationship, and he discovers that he wants to go out and have a family with this woman, and he's thinking about making his career of IMF just a thing in the past. And so now he's more interested about just having a life and starting a family and all this stuff, and kind of thinking about just sort of leaving IMF in the dust a little bit. However, considering this movie is called Mission Impossible, spoiler alert, IMF needs him for another important mission. But unlike the first two movies, the deeper he goes into this mission, the more personal it gets, in ways I don't really want to get into for spoilers. For those who don't know what I'm doing, I absolutely love Mission Impossible, and I want to share my love for Mission Impossible by marathoning all 5 of the movies. Why am I doing it now instead of like before Rogue Nation or before MI6? Mainly just because I love Mission Impossible and I just want to get my opinion out there. If you haven't already seen my review for Mission Impossible or Mission Impossible 2, then both of my reviews for those movies are definitely on my channel, so you can go and check them out. But I'll quickly run down my overall opinions. I overall think that the first one is a very, very good film. It is by far the best film of 1996. It's a very, very great drama slash thriller, as well as a bit of an action film. I think it's overall a very great movie. If you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend it. I think the first film was a great film. Mission Impossible 2 was less fortunate. Despite the fact that it was newer than the original, the first one came out in 1996 and this came out in the year 2000, but this one's aged less. It's actually pretty dated because it tries to be hip and cool and slick, and it just comes off as silly. The story has a lot of really cringe-worthy moments. You just really can't take the story seriously. The first half of the movie is really hard to sit through because it's really exposition heavy, and it's overall just an alright film. It's pretty hard to take seriously, and it is by far the worst film in the franchise. And I am happy to say that Mission Impossible 3 is the movie in the franchise that finally picked things back up again. Pretty much everything I complained about in my Mission Impossible 2 review has been eradicated in this movie. I have to think about it, but I honestly at the moment think that Mission Impossible 3 might be the best one of the original trilogy. Maybe I like the first one a bit better, I'm not too sure. I really like the third and first one. And as I said before, this film was directed by J.J Abrams, who was a first-time director originally when making this movie. This is J.J Abrams' first movie. It doesn't show? No, not really. He actually did a really great job of directing this movie. He had a very great unique style, and overall he just did a great job of directing the film, and it definitely showed considering he went on and had success and did other films in the future. In fact, last year he made a very underrated film that I don't really think too many people have heard about or really saw. It's a very small film that I don't think too many people know about or even really talk about. He made a very underrated film called Star Wars The Force Awakens. You've probably never heard of it. So why is Mission Impossible 3 such an improvement over Mission Impossible 2? Well, for starters, it isn't overly stylistic. They got rid of the doves, they got rid of the slow-mo, and despite the fact that the film is really about Ethan Hunt trying to start a family, it doesn't really have this real forced romance subplot that was in the second one. This movie kind of has romance, but it's not really romance, it's more of a protect someone you love kind of thing. It's really hard to explain. Basically, the second one had romance, and it was really just about romance and Ethan Hunt falling in love with her. However, in this movie, it's more a protection kind of thing. It's actually really hard to explain what I mean, but you probably know what I mean if you've seen the films yourself. Also, this movie has a fantastic opening. Only just within the first few seconds of the movie, you're instantly hooked and you're instantly attracted and you really want to continue watching the movie to see what happens next. In fact, it goes without exaggeration that, in my opinion, this movie has one of my favourite first scenes of all time. Having a great, strong opening first scene is pretty hard to accomplish in my opinion, but this movie did it. This movie had a very well executed opening. In fact, overall, Mission Impossible 3 has a very well written story. Quite possibly the best in the entire franchise. There are very few dull moments in Mission Impossible 3. Out of all 5 Mission Impossible films, this is the only film in the entire franchise that felt like it was constantly moving forward and it was always making pace. All of the other films in the series always have at least one moment where it kind of either slows down or stops altogether. And I mean every other movie in the franchise does this at one point in my opinion. But this one feels like it's constantly moving, and the drama and the relationships and everything about this movie, it feels like it's structured really well, and the progression of the plot is always changing, and it just feels like the overall best story in the entire franchise. It just felt like that out of all 5 films, this is the one that was mostly consistently moving forward. And also, Ethan Hunt, it's great to see you back again! For those who saw my review of Mission Impossible 2, you would know that I kind of complained about Ethan Hunt just sort of being a completely different character as he was to the first movie. The first movie, he was this vulnerable, character who was really good at his job, however he had a very good vulnerable side to him. He felt like a human being, he felt like a person. Yes, he does this incredibly dangerous stuff, which comes to the name Mission Impossible. However, deep inside, he has a lot of issues, he's vulnerable, he is not a superhero. And I also complained about Ethan Hunt's personality being really drained and washed out in Mission Impossible 2, felt like a pretty dull person. The Ethan Hunt that I really loved and appreciated from the first movie has finally returned in this movie. This feels like the same guy that I loved from the first one. He has that great, vulnerable-like personality, and you can truly tell that the thing that he really cares about is just the protection of everyone around him. All he wants is to make sure that everyone he cares about is safe. And sometimes, that's pretty difficult to do. But I love his determination, I love his personality, I love his attitude. Everything about Ethan Hunt's character has been approved upon. I love this guy. Ethan Hunt in this movie has a lot more personality than he did in the last movie. And while we're on the character subject, let's talk about the introduction to quite possibly one of my favourite characters in the entire franchise, Benji. I love Benji. Now, I do know that he's really not in this movie for very long, he's only in a couple of scenes, but some of his moments are really funny. He just has this real bright, fun sense of humour kind of character. He's just a really funny character. He's kind of like the comic relief of the rest of the franchise. However, he's just such an entertaining character. I love this guy. I am so glad that they expanded on his character in Ghost Protocol and Rogue Nation. And again, he has some really funny moments. Okay, so your criminal seems to be dealing with this special weapon-like device known as the Rabbit's Foot for $3 billion, by the way. Or maybe I'm wrong, maybe it's not a weapon, maybe it's just a really expensive bunny appendage. That scene makes me laugh every single time. I love this guy. So glad that they brought him back for Ghost Protocol and Rogue Nation, and I am so glad that they're bringing him back once again for MI6. And I also find myself really invested in the drama between Ethan, Julia, and Luther. And then we have the villain. Now, one thing that a lot of people seem to complain about, myself included, is the fact that Mission Impossible isn't really good with villains. Well, at least as far as the movies go. I can't really say about the original TV show because I haven't seen the show. But movies, definitely, they have a lot of problems with villains. And I can definitely say that while it's not saying much, this movie definitely has the best villain in the entire franchise. Well, mainly because he does have a lot of personality and he's a very threatening guy. Whenever I'm watching this movie, I really do feel like that this guy could kill Ethan Hunt. I watched this movie and for the first time viewing, I really had this feeling that Ethan could potentially die. This guy was very threatening. Not only was he threatening, but he also was just overall a great human being. You could see where this guy was coming from. He had a really good compelling motivation. You look at this guy and you hear his attitude and you hear the way he talks to Ethan Hunt and you're like, yeah, no wonder you hate this guy. One character I do have a problem with in this movie though is this certain character who I just don't really like, mainly because he does that whole switching side things from side to side, like he's good, now he's bad, oh, like he's good, no, he's bad again. And so throughout the entire movie you're trying to figure out, whose side are you on exactly? And he changes so many times that his motives just get confused, and you don't really care about this guy because you don't know what his motives are. Now, I do know that they do a very similar thing with Professor Snape in the Harry Potter films, however it worked, because in Deathly Hallows Part 2, they made it absolutely clear you knew exactly where Snape was coming from, and they had a big 10-minute long flashback or something that explained the whole story. So you eventually got and understood the motivation, so you could see where Snape was coming from, and you could see why he kept on switching sides. However, the closest thing was sort of just get this line where he just goes, "It's complicated." And I do like how you do try to have complex characters. There are some people that are not all good and not all bad. Some people are in the middle. However, it just doesn't work, because not only is it hard for you to figure out whose side he's on, but it's also hard for you to figure out what his motives are. Why does he keep changing sides like that? It's not explained. If you want to have a good character that keeps on changing sides, definitely look at how Professor Snape was done in the Harry Potter films. That is how you make a great character that keeps changing sides. The cinematography in this movie is pretty good. I like the style it has, but there is one thing that J.J. Abrams does in this movie that I do find kind of bothersome, and it's the fact that he does a lot of close-ups, and there's quite a bit of shaky cam in this movie, and it really gets on my nerves. One thing I do think is pretty cool with it is the way the shaky cam is utilized, because for example, like if they're in a moving vehicle, usually the camera is nice and steady. However, you open the door, you have all this feeling of wind rushing through the camera and everything, and that's when the camera starts to shake, and then suddenly the doors close, and then it goes back to normal and goes back onto the tripod. That kind of idea I do like. However, when the camera is shaking, not to mention shaking in close-ups, it can be pretty hard to see. And he also does this when the scene is trying to be emotional, and you just can't get that emotionally invested into the scene because you're too busy getting distracted by the shaking camera. I, for one, really despise shaky cam, and I'm one of those people who hate shaky cam so much I can't even appreciate it in the Bourne movies. Yeah, I hate it that much. I'm not going to say that it's a serious problem, because the times when J.J. Abrams uses shaky cam in this movie are definitely few and far between. However, when it does occur, it can get really annoying. And the action overall in this movie is pretty great. It looks realistic, it still holds up really well today, it looks really, really good. There's a great action scene early on where Ethan Hunt has to save another IMF agent, which is really thrilling. It's a great scene. There's also another good scene on the bridge. That scene's pretty cool. And quite possibly my favourite action scene in the entire movie, the whole scene where he swings on a rope and then he jumps onto another building. The action is well filmed and it looks great. However, one major complaint I have about the action in this movie is that it's kind of the most generic action in the franchise. What I mean by this is because in one way or another, every other Mission Impossible movie has one great standout action scene. The first one had the bullet train scene and the CIA vault scene. The second one had the motorbike scene and the rock climbing scene, and maybe one or two others that had it stand out. Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol had the Burj Khalifa scene. More on that in my Ghost Protocol review. And Mission Impossible Rogue Nation had three. It had the underwater sequence, the motorbike sequence, and the airplane sequence. One of the reasons why I love Mission Impossible as a whole so much is because they really stand out from other movies. A lot of action movies is just shooting guns, or hand-to-hand combat, or explosions, or car chases. Let's talk about one of my favourite action movie franchises of all time. One I'm actually planning on marathoning right after this one, actually. The Die Hard movies. Great films, by the way. Don't know about the fifth one because I heard it sucked and I haven't seen it yet. However, while they are great films, especially the first four, I do have to agree that they definitely do have that trap about just being in types of action scenes. The fourth one had a bunch of car chase sequences, and the first three had a lot of shootout scenes. They're just different aspects they do with the characters, like having John McClane barefoot, that had it stand out from the others. Mission Impossible for me is that one franchise that sort of leaps out of those categories and put our main characters into absurd situations that you wouldn't see in any other action movie. And that is why I love Mission Impossible. And honestly, Mission Impossible 3 doesn't really have that kind of action scene in my opinion. As far as action goes, I wouldn't say it's bad, it's pretty fun and entertaining, but this is definitely the most generic action out of the entire franchise. We can all make fun of the action scenes in Mission Impossible 2, but it's more just silly, it's just something we laugh at, but it's not generic, it's just something we like to laugh and make fun of. That's my biggest problem with Mission Impossible 3. The action is just not as strong as it is in any of the other four films. And it honestly does impact the film in a pretty negative way in my opinion. This movie has great characters and a great story, but the action really does pull that movie down from being the best Mission Impossible film. The scene where Ethan Hunt swings on the rope and then crashes onto the rooftop, that's close to being really, really creative. And if they did more action scenes like that and got more creative and thought outside the box more with the action like they do with the other 4 films, then this could possibly be my favourite movie in the entire franchise. However, I just think it's just a good movie. And again, I love the score. This score, as well as Ghost Protocol score, is done by Michael Giacchino. And I'm going to be honest, he did a great job at composing the score for this movie. In fact, the funny thing is that I think it's really interesting that I've got 2 movie posters completely different from each other, and yet Michael Giacchino did the score for both movies. I think that is really cool, actually. Honestly, Michael Giacchino is my absolute #1 favorite score composer. If I make it into the film industry and I get to choose a score composer, I will try and get Michael Giacchino to compose the score for whatever movie I make. I overall think it's a pretty great score. So in short, Mission Impossible 3 is overall a lot of fun. It's a good, fun movie. However, the action is a little bit more generic. It has a pretty well written story, as well as great relationships with the characters, and overall, it is a pretty good movie. And going with it is a good style, it's well directed, and it has pretty decent cinematography, as well as a really good score, but is really sucked down by generic action. And that's really the biggest problem I have with this movie, because while it shouldn't be the focus of an action film, let's be honest, why do we watch action movies in the first place? Probably to watch action. I'm going to give Mission Impossible 3 a B. Definitely a good film, but I definitely wouldn't say it's the best of the films. Maybe the best in the original trilogy, but I wouldn't say it's the best in the franchise. Stay tuned for my review for Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. I cannot wait to talk about that one. But until then, hasta la vista, baby.